And I say, I think one thing that would be really engaging is when these apostles go on these ministry trips to other countries, I think you should document it and just pull out some of the raw moments, interactions they have with members and put it on their Instagram. Just lean into what they're good at, which is talking to people in these settings they do every day in these stake conferences and all over the world, mic them up and let's just show some of those interactions. And I'm like, okay, will you go do it? Like, sure, I'll take a stab, And so they sent me with Elder Anderson to the Philippines for about 10 days. And, we're in state conferences and we set up a few Q&As with the youth, some specific moments to capture for social media. And we scheduled a visit to go visit a local bishop and just visit his family in his home. Like, it's a cool thing to document, an apostle just visiting a local bishop in his home and seeing how he's doing and gave his kid a blessing. And like, that's a cool moment to capture,
Mm-hmm. Welcome to the Leading Saints podcast. I'm in my studio today, but I'm here to introduce a podcast that we did in a different studio. I traveled down to St. George, Utah, where Parker Walbeck lives. You may know him from The True Millennial. I guess it's a podcast, but an online channel on YouTube. He does some phenomenal content and really preaches the gospel in a unique way and puts out such positive faith-promoting content. And while I was down in St. George, we connected and had a great interview. He even turned the tables on me at the end, and then he'll release an interview on his channel later on as well. But Parker has such a unique experience and background doing online social media and video content. He made a name for himself outside of any church platform. Just in the YouTube world. He was an early YouTuber and then translated that to not only helping the church as a consultant, but doing his True Millennial podcast. And he had a unique perspective and idea of helping our church leaders, the general authorities, the Quorum of the 12, produce their online content. And so he reached out to the church. He tells his whole story, and it ended up with him traveling with Elder Anderson to the Philippines to record just some real authentic content of Elder Anderson's ministry. So he actually goes over some things he learned on his trip, traveling with an ordained apostle. So it's fantastic. And then we talk about all things social media, how to voice your faith and share your faith online, the do's and don'ts and things to consider. And then how do we maybe get the negative things about social media out of our life. So here's my interview with Parker Walbeck. Parker Walbeck, welcome to your studio.
Yeah, good to be here and good to have you.
Yeah, I was in town. So
Yeah.
I reached out and said, hey, let's get together. And if you wouldn't mind firing up your studio, I'd love to fire some questions at you. But we're going to have more of a discussion, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
We talked
We'll
about.
go back and forth.
So if people aren't aware of you and what you do, how do you explain that?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a strange guy. No, I got True Millennial is a, I guess, podcast. You could call it half podcast, half. I do a lot of repurposing of the Brethren's content.
Like you'll take a conference talk quote and put some
repackaging
images.
stuff that's already out there in a way that's a little more engaging and more. I'm trying to reach two audiences because I think the long form is maybe a little more interesting to an older audience, but you got these younger audiences, teenagers and stuff, and I get a lot of comments from Sunday school teachers and such that will say, "Oh, we love your 2 to 3 minute little videos. Like our 12-year-olds can't pay attention to a 20-minute." President Oaks talk, but when you package it in 2 minutes with some music and visuals, like they actually engage with that. So trying to reach multiple audiences there, but yeah, True Millennial, just trying to further the gospel message in ways that are more engaging and shareable. So.
Yeah. So are you a millennial then?
I am technically
What year
a
were you
millennial.
born?
In 1989.
Cool. So I was 82, and depending on which scale you look at,
Yeah,
I'm like
you're on
the
the
oldest
cusp,
of the
yeah.
millennials, right? I consider myself a millennial, even though I'm
But
a
the
little older.
millennial name, True Millennial, it's based off of President Nelson's talk that he gave, basically saying that we should all become true millennials, which is, he defined it as, he was talking to millennials, but he said we're all millennials, true millennials, in the fact that we're all preparing for the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. And so
that's
we
cool.
can all do that. So I have older guests on and younger guests, but we're all true millennials if we're preparing ourselves and others for a second coming. So.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily that's your target audience either.
I tend to relate most to them because I'm in the stage that they're in. And so the things I'm talking about is, raising young kids and parenting and, some of the stuff that I'm currently in. So my content tends to lean heavier towards millennials, but it's for everyone.
Yeah. So was there like a moment when this idea came to you, or you thought I need to have a place in the pool of content here?
Yeah. I mean, so I've been doing this for a living for the past decade, 12 years or so. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was in college, and I picked up a camera and just kind of fell in love with content creation and kind of got into the YouTube space before it was even a space.
Wow.
So people would ask, what do you do for a living? And this is, 12 years ago. I'd say, oh, I'm a YouTuber. And they would be like, oh, can you make money doing that? Like they didn't even know that it was an occupation.
Yeah.
Now it's more, mainstream. But so I was kind of in the early beginnings of pioneering YouTube with Devin Supertramp was my boss at the time. And I got to travel the world and film all this awesome content. And I basically learned the process of creating shareable content that has the potential to go viral. It was kind of viral was the word back then. And so I just learned a lot of the tricks and the trade of social media and content creation. And at a certain point, probably 7 years or so into my career, I just started feeling the Spirit saying, hey, you need to utilize some of these skills and talents that you're developing to build the kingdom. And we consecrate to do that in the temple, right? That's one of the things we covenant to do, is to consecrate our time and our talents and everything with which the Lord has blessed us to the building up of his kingdom, right? And I felt like I had a lot. I mean, I'd be in my business and I'd be running Facebook ads or doing YouTube videos, and I would just think, man, if the church could figure out what I'm figuring out right now, missionary work would explode. And the Spirit's starting to tell me, well, then you should probably start doing that, And so I kind of pushed it off like, well, I'm so busy with work and I've got all these employees and young kids. And so I just kind of pushed off the promptings for a while. But after 2 or 3 years of pushing it off, we had our third kid, and that kind of forced me to be a lot more at home and more present. We just needed all hands on deck for a few months there. So I was kind of stepping away from all the business for a while, and it just kind of gave me a new perspective on what was most important. And the Spirit just hit me hard and said, it's time. Like you've been very successful in business, but this life isn't about making an extra few million. Like you've made plenty for your needs. So let's start devoting more of your time to building the kingdom. And so that was about 2-3 years ago. And so I just started brainstorming, okay, what does it look like? How do I? And I think that's one of the questions a lot of people struggle with when they're trying to figure out how to share the gospel online, is because I have a lot of people now asking me, how should I do this? I'm trying to figure out how to share the gospel. It's really hard to know where to even start. And so what I started with was like, well, look, I'm just going to commit to once a week, I'm going to share something on my Instagram story, even if it's not something I create, just like a post from somebody else, something the church did. Just get in the habit of regularly advocating for and showing publicly something that demonstrates your faith. And that's a hard first step for a lot of people to even do that. And it was for me too. But I started doing that, and I got in the rhythm of, okay, once a week, and at first it was just kind of like whatever I was studying that week, I'll just share something that stood out to me, just a quick little testimony about, a scripture or a talk or something. And then I started having people say, hey, can you put these on Reels? I want to be able to share it, because you can't share a story. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess, but I don't really want to put these in my feed, because my feed is just like pictures of my kids. Yeah. And so I'm like, how do I mix gospel messages with, and now today a picture of my kid, So it's kind of on my personal account, like I'm not sure how to do this. So, and then I'm like, why don't I just create a separate account that I can put all my spiritual thoughts on? And then I started brainstorming, okay, what do I call it? And that's when I came across that True Millennial talk by President Nelson. It just kind of stuck out to me. And I'm like, I'm a true millennial. I'm a millennial. And I'm very into preparing for the second coming. And so that's the name I chose. And I'm like, I don't even know if this will stick, but this is what we'll go with. So I created an account and started putting reels up there. And I was honestly shocked at the initial response. I just recognized very quickly how hungry Latter-day Saints are for something to share, because not everybody has the talents and skills to put together something really, edited really fancy. And I just realized that, the Lord's been waiting on me to share my specific skill set so that other members could utilize that as a resource to, like I said, share in a Sunday school class or just put in their story, give them something to share, and so it's been really, it's been shocking really to see the response and how supportive members have been and how grateful they've been that I've been willing. And I don't even think I'm that great at it, but I'm like, I do know how to edit video, and so I'm going to at least do what I know how to do. And so now I'm always encouraging other people, like, if I can do it, anyone can do it. Like, let's all start, contributing. And I always tell people, like, we each have a unique perspective and angle at which we understand the gospel and how we've come to know it's true. And I can reach certain people with my perspective, but Kurt can reach certain people that I can't reach because of your unique experiences. And everybody has their unique experiences. And if we're all willing to share those, we can each reach different people that the others can't. And so that's why I think it's a commandment that we share the gospel, is because it takes all of us to reach everyone.
Yeah. So maybe boil down like just your general guidance for the everyday church member who's not, they don't own a camera other than the one on their phone. And I mean, should they, obviously if they have a desire to create content, great, jump in, just, like both of our stories, it's sort of like we just sort of, let's try this and that, and this worked, right? And over time it's like, I kind of built a skill set here, but maybe even those that don't want to create content, like is it just continuing to share? I mean, because sometimes we worry about we're overwhelming other people with this religious content or this or that. But.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the easiest way was like on a Sunday, the world generally expects a little more spirituality on Sunday, not everywhere. And unfortunately, we're leaning less and less towards Sunday being a sacred day.
Yeah.
But I think generally most people in the world recognize that as a more spiritual day. So I think that's a great place to start. Okay, on Sunday, it's a little bit easier to slip something spiritual in on a Sunday. And then I think one of the easiest ways to start is just to share something that somebody else has put out. And you don't have to say anything about it, but just like a share on your personal Instagram story. It can be very non-invasive. It's like, come click on my story if you want. If you don't like seeing spiritual stuff, then don't come to my stories on Sunday. But if people know that, like, that's something that person does every Sunday, then if they like it, they'll know, I want to go check it out. If they don't, they'll know to steer clear. But it's just a very, I feel like, indirect way to start. And then once you post something like, for example, what I'm doing at True Millennial, I put out a reel. It's very supportive to my channel to have people sharing it. And so that's a very small thing for somebody just to put my reel on their story. But when 20,000 people do that, it's like, now it's out there. And a lot of people can see the prophet's most recent message, And so I'd say that's the bare minimum. That's a really easy, that takes all of 30 seconds to just go follow other creators. And you're not going to like everything that all creators are producing, but find your creator that you're like, I like the way he relates the gospel or, shares the gospel. And then just be a supporter and go share their stuff every once in a while. Or just the church's account, right? Just go and share stuff that they're posting. I think that's the bare minimum, easiest first step. And then as you make that a habit, you'll naturally want to do more. And you'll be like, okay, maybe I'll put a little message below that and say, I really liked this, So you just do, and then pretty soon you're sharing your testimony. I experienced something similar to this. And then maybe you turn the camera on and even do a video of yourself in your story. So it's what I asked this question to Elder Bednar in an interview I did with him. And he said, line upon line, precept upon precept. Like, you're not going to be a content creator overnight, but to learn how to share the gospel, we just have to act, just try, and then the Spirit will guide us to help us know how to do it more effectively as we try.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I appreciate just this concept of finding those content creators that are doing the hard work already, right? And you just have to repurpose their content or share it.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes, depending on it's not like you necessarily have an audience, but it's your neighbors, it's your
Right.
coworkers that are already following you, and every once in a while they hear that message, and it may come to them in a time where, wow, I really needed that message, because that's really popular. Just these cuts from podcast interviews or speeches or whatever, and we're doing the same thing with General Conference, where someone may like, wow, I wonder what philosopher that is. Literally, they know it's an apostle of God that spoke at General Conference.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And it's powerful.
Well, there's one of the questions, or I guess comments I get when I encourage people to try sharing the gospel on their social media is they'll say, well, I don't have very many followers. I only have like 100 followers, so what's the point? And I'm always telling them, like, the people that you influence most, the people closest to you, family, friends, they're the people you're going to have the most influence over anyway. And so if those are the only people that follow you, they're the ones that actually care about what you believe in and will actually take to heart what you're saying. I might have 50,000 followers or something, but most of them don't have a clue who I am. And so for all they know, like, here's some random weirdo. But like, if it's one of my close family or friends, like, that's honestly the people that I'm sharing the gospel for, that I'm putting out this stuff for, is I want the people that I love and know most to know what I believe, And so even if it's just your own children or your own parents that get to see you share testimony, or even just, if you're not even sharing a testimony, just sharing somebody else's, sharing the church's post, it's a declaration in and of itself that I'm a believer. I'm in. And that in and of itself is enough to make someone maybe doubt some of their doubts. Like, oh, well, if they're still in, you haven't say anything. But just by sharing the church's post or somebody else's post, it sends a message that I believe in this. And it might help somebody who's struggling to be like, well, I respect and love that person. I know they love me. They're a good person. And if they're in, should I really be leaving? It'll sow some doubt just by showing people that you still believe.
Yeah. It's interesting. The online model sort of skewed our perception of influence and audience, where, you think of a typical sacrament meeting, maybe 200, 250 people there, if it's a strong ward, right?
Yeah.
Never, when the bishop comes to you and says, will you speak in sacrament meeting, be like,
it's not enough
there's
people.
only 200 people there. Like, why would I waste my time?
Not even worth it.
but nonetheless, we spend hours like preparing this talk. I'm speaking in church. It's like, you literally have that podium to stand on with those handful of people. So
maybe only 50 are actually listening.
Yeah.
It's not that big of an audience,
right.
But you spend so much time, because even if it touches one, it's worth it.
And it's so interesting because you think of the time and focus that goes into like a formal sacrament meeting talk. There's a cadence about the way you do it. And even online now, you see, someone sit in their car, like, that's very popular. Like, and they just they just give this mic drop moment, right? About whether it's religious or not, but like that, no production value. But if it's true, if it rings to their soul, like,
it'll resonate.
Right? And you even look at the funniest meme online can be so low production and it's silly, but it can make you belly laugh because it's the humor is true. It's there, right? But so the same with, it can be in your car, it can be with your kids, it can be wherever. Right?
That's a great point. Is just that I think people are afraid that it's not going to be professional, but like even the apostles, I've been helping out shooting some of their content. A lot of it's shot on phones. Most of their stuff in their offices, they just pull out an iPhone. So if the apostles can use an iPhone, so can an everyday member.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And would you be open to talking a little bit about what you've done with the apostles? So, because a few months ago, you went with Elder Anderson to the Philippines, right?
Yeah. So
maybe what's the story behind all that?
So I've been doing the true millennial stuff for a couple of years, and I just reached out to some of the people I knew at the church and said, "Hey, do you need any help with some of the brethren's content? I do this for a living, and I'd be happy to just volunteer my time." And they're very humble and teachable over there, and are always ecstatic for some members willing to lend some of their time and talents. So if you have time and talents,
right,
go to the kingdom and say, what can I do to help? Like, I feel like we have this idea that the church needs to do this, the church needs to do that. And it's like, guys, we are the church.
Right. And if they want me, they'll ask, right?
Exactly. They'll call me to it. It's like, well, why don't you go and volunteer?
Yeah.
You know, we have this idea that, there's employees and people who will take care of everything at the church. And yeah, they do have people taking care of stuff, but if you have some talents to offer, they'll gladly have some of that, and there's a wide variety. It's not just social media, we're talking carpentry, I don't know, just there's all different kinds of things the church does on a daily basis that they would be happy to have people donating their time and talents to help further the work, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, so I approached them and said, I'd be happy to help if you guys need anything. I do social media for a living, so if you need consulting or whatever, just I'm here to help, And in one of these consulting calls, they asked for some ideas, and I say, I think one thing that would be really engaging is when these apostles go on these ministry trips to other countries. I think you should document it and just pull out some of the raw moments, interactions they have with members, and put it on their Instagram. Because a lot of the format they have been doing is just them talking to a camera, and they're not professionals at influencing on social media, so it comes across a little awkward sometimes. And I'm like, just lean into what they're good at, which is talking to people in these settings they do every day in these stake conferences and all over the world, mic them up and let's just show some of those interactions. And they're like, okay, will you go do it? I'm like, sure, I'll take a stab, And so they sent me with Elder Anderson to the Philippines for about 10 days. And, we're in state conferences, and we set up a few Q&As with the youth, some specific moments to capture for social media. And so, there were some more setup moments that we would hope we would get some good content out of. We scheduled a visit to go visit a local bishop and just visit his family in his home. Like, it's a cool thing to document, an apostle just visiting a local bishop in his home and seeing how he's doing, and gave his kid a blessing. And like, that's a cool moment to capture, And so we did that, and the videos performed really well. They were all on Elder Anderson's Instagram account, so if you want to check those out, that's where they're at. But now they wanted me to go do more, and I'm like, well, I got 4 young kids, and I can't really be traveling 10 days every month.
Yeah.
So I helped them hire some people they already have some people traveling already. And so we just kind of shifted some of the content to be more social media focused, but then also helped them hire some guys to go and shoot social media specific content for the brethren. So they're starting to do that more. And the hopes is that every ministry trip they do now, they're a little bit better documented. And sometimes there's certain trips they don't want to be as documented or whatever.
Yeah.
But the idea is just to, I guess, have more raw, authentic transparency, showing what these brethren do, because they're amazing. I mean, being with Elder Anderson for 10 days, at the age they are, I've done a lot of traveling in my life, and I'm like 35 now. That jet lag and being on planes, and it took me a month to recover from that trip. Like, ask my wife, I was like losing my mind. I couldn't sleep because of the time change. And these guys are doing this like every month. Wow. It's absolutely insane. And it really brings to light that scripture that their bodies will be renewed. You can see it in real time, that at that age, 80s and 90s, that they're able to travel the world like that and be in planes. There is some real priesthood power behind the work they're doing. But it was really a really great privilege to rub shoulders with Elder Anderson, and him and his wife, Sister Anderson. They're awesome. And I don't know, you see both sides. You get to see the apostolic mantle version and the human side that feels like, hey, like you're my grandpa, just feels like I'm chatting with my grandpa, And so it was really cool. They took us out, the media team, out to lunch a couple times, and just wanted to ask us about our families. And so I've grown to really love the Andersons specifically because of that trip.
Yeah.
And this is random, but Elder Anderson reached out to me and just called me on Christmas Day. I'm with my family, and he leaves me. I didn't have my phone, and he leaves me a message. I'm sorry, this is probably strange to call you on Christmas Day, but I just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas and let you know I was thinking about you. My son is doing this, and it reminded me of you. I wanted to connect you guys, and like, just a really sweet, awesome guy, you know. And so anyway, it was really cool because you got to see the human side, but one of the coolest aspects about that trip was in every setting he was in, every meeting, the bishop house visit, he would always bear his apostolic witness that he knows Jesus Christ lives. And I've heard him say that in general conference. I've heard him say it 100 times, and I heard him say it probably 50 times in those 10 days. But every single time he would bear his apostolic witness, the Spirit would flood into the room. And you could feel something so special and unique about that apostolic witness that is unlike anything I felt in person, hearing someone bear their witness. I mean, you and I have testimonies, and it's important for all of us to share them. But every time he bore that apostolic witness, the Spirit testified. I mean, there was times where, like, we were at the MTC one time, and I'm like falling asleep because I'm jet lagged, and I'm barely staying awake filming him. He's been talking for an hour. And so I'm a little bit tuned out. As soon as he starts bearing his apostolic witness, I'm just honed in, the Spirit's there, and it's amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it reminds me of my mission president. He would do this thing at the end of his own conference where, at the moment he's bearing his testimony, he would recognize the authority that he stands in, and he'd say something like, according to the keys that I hold, I blessed you, elders and sisters, and it was just sort of this tender moment that is, through that filter of the authority. And, authority is we have such a strong tradition in that. And to recognize that's what is really happening in this room. It's not just some guy named Neil.
Yep.
No, this is an apostle, and he's speaking from that authority, and it's powerful. I think that's a great leadership principle. Anything else that comes to mind you want to share about just traveling or stories that come up? Or
I actually at one point had written down some of the things that stood out to me on that trip, and I've never really shared them. So let me pull it up real quick.
Sure, yeah.
Anderson.
It was meant for this moment.
Yeah, I guess. Well, yeah, this was so I had written down 5 things that kind of stood out to me about being with an apostle for those 10 days. I wrote, he ministers to the one. He takes time to learn names, cares about individuals, shakes every hand when there's hundreds lined up. So we were in these state conferences where there would be, there had to have been over 1,000 people in the state conference, and he took an hour and a half to let everyone line up and have 5 seconds with an apostle to say hi and shake his hand. And not that they all have to do that, and that, that's an expectation, but I just thought it was really cool that he was willing to take the time. When the first time I met him, I had him mic'd up so I could hear what he was saying, but he was in the other room with his security guard. And
that's dangerous.
Yeah.
But luckily it was just you, right?
And obviously I would never share anything that they didn't want shared. But he was just asking the security guard, hey, remind me the names of we were about to go meet some people. Remind me the names. And he would have before the Q&As, for example, with the youth, he would say, send me the pictures of all the youth and their names, and he'd make sure to memorize them. And so before he would interact with people, he would make sure he knew your name and would address you by name. And I think that was an invitation that President Nelson had given at one point. And Elder Anderson, I think, is one of the greatest examples of following the prophet, even as an apostle.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether he got that from the prophet, but he follows everything the prophet says to a T. And that was one thing that really stood out to me, is that he cared, that he knew your name and would make every interaction feel very personal. So really,
that's cool.
Really cool. I just kind of mentioned this, but he constantly quoted the prophet. So you would think he's an apostle, he has authority, so he can just stand on his own 2 legs and whatever he says is scripture, and there's a lot of truth to that. But I was shocked at how many of the words came out of his mouth was, the prophet teaches this, the prophet said that, the prophet, he would always start these sentences with just repeating what our living prophet is telling us to do. So I thought that was really interesting, that I was kind of expecting him to be his own source of wealth of knowledge, and he is, but he was deferring to that authority of the prophetic mantle a lot, even as an apostle, which I think is just a really good example of the humility, even as somebody as wise and knowledgeable in the gospel as he is, to follow the prophet and not think we know better than him, which I think is a common thing in the church. It's like, well, he's old and outdated, so I know more than he knows. That's a common thing that I hear people saying. I don't believe that, but
right.
But it's just cool seeing somebody who would have every reason to say, I know a lot, to defer to the prophet's wisdom.
No, that's wise. That's wise. And it makes me think that requires you to be very familiar with what he says.
Yeah.
Not like, yeah, I heard him in conference. That's all
He's
and I
definitely
just retained
studying
all.
it.
Yeah, he's studying it. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's cool.
He constantly speaks about his wife and the natural spirituality of women in general. So he was always looping in his wife as an important part of his ministry, as an important part of one of the questions he got at one point was, how do we prepare our kids to serve missions and go to the temple? And his answer was mostly just about having a great mother and sort of talking about his experience with how great his wife was raising their kids. And he's just always talking about how awesome his wife is and how important she is to the work of families and the work of the gospel. So just you could tell that he really adores and loves his wife, and that they're a great team that works together within their family to raise great children, and just, I guess, the opposite of this idea that they're a patriarchy and that they tell their wife what to do. Like, it was the complete opposite. Obviously he has his mantle, right? And that's an important calling he bears. But there was no looking down upon, or it was an amazing relationship and partnership, watching them work together.
This reminds me of a moment. I was actually at the MTC at a different event, and I was sort of behind the scenes a little bit. And Elder Anderson was practicing his remarks for that meeting, and he read through them, and then his wife was in the room. And at the end, with a few others there, he said, feedback, what'd you think? How could I improve it? And his wife was not slow to say, here's boom, 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 a few things that came to mind. You could tell he was very thoughtful and processing that, like, oh yeah, that's a great point. I should make some adjustments there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool.
And yeah, he's a very humble man, and yeah, she had great input, and she was speaking at every conference, and you can just tell that he really he sees her testimony and opinions about the gospel just as valid as his own.
Yeah, that's great. Is that all of them, or is there more?
I mentioned that he always bears his special witness. This was another thing that stood out, is he teaches basic, simple doctrines. Child of God, teaching children to pray, loving your wife, know the scriptures. I was kind of expecting, like, well, I'm going to be with him for 10 days. I'm going to get some, like, treasures, some gems that you're not going to hear over the pulpit. And there's nothing complex. He's not focusing on specific applications. It's all just the core doctrines and principles of the gospel. And we get kind of lulled to sleep in general conference, like, oh, I've heard this one, faith, prayer, reading scriptures, and we just kind of tune out when we hear the basics. And it's like, but that's what keeps us in. Yeah. That's what keeps our testimony strong. That's what keeps the fruits of the gospel coming in our lives. That's the way, And I think too often we're looking past the mark for something spectacular. And it was just really cool being with him for 10 days and just seeing, like, I'm sure he has some spectacular things he could share, but he understands and knows that what we need are to master the basics.
Yeah.
And so if we hear something spectacular, it's not going to do us much good if we haven't bought into the idea that we should read scriptures every day and that we should pray every day,
Yeah. It makes me think of, and this is just my perspective, but there seems to be this trend in our faith and others, but where we all have this feeling of, I'm supposed to learn the scriptures and become pretty close to a BYU religion professor. Yeah. Like, I want to be on that level. I know the Hebrew, I know this translation, which that's fun to learn about. And we all, we got it's our helpful podcast or things, the commentaries. Sure, it's fun to go there, but it's the point of relationship with God where it's very basic. It's very simple. And to me, I'm more of like, all right, as I approach this day and I want to dig into scripture or whatever, am I doing it to be more like knowledgeable or so it appears like I have some PhD in religion, or do I want to connect with God and have him remind me that I'm loved, that I can do today, and that on Sunday his redemption will be sitting on that table once again for me to partake, right? like, oh yeah, I want to do that. And I can sit with the scripture and just appreciate,
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Smith for what he did or what he didn't
Yeah.
do, or what, the man he was and the prophet he was and all that. Right. And that point of relationship is powerful. And so
Yeah.
you see that model by the apostles, is that, we want to bring that relational gospel to people, not necessarily the PhD gospel, which is still fun.
No, I think that's spot on. There's plenty of value in the, I guess, the academic or the intellectual part of. I think that aids and helps and fosters a good foundation on which faith can flourish. But ultimately, faith won't flourish unless we are doing those basic things of reading scriptures, praying, going to church. I think you look at and I think because of social media and the overwhelm of information and being inundated with these philosophical ideas and a lot of anti-Mormon stuff that's trying to disprove the religion through intellectual arguments, we feel like, well, if I'm going to be able to survive spiritually, then I'm going to need to learn all of the counter arguments and the ins and outs of all these church history and like you said, like the Hebrew meanings of things, because that's what we're seeing on social media. That makes you a smart, knowledgeable person in the gospel. But what our prophet told us to spiritual survival is to have the constant companionship of the Holy Ghost. Like that's what the Holy Ghost is pure intelligence. So if we're looking for becoming more intelligent, reading books and gaining all that wisdom of the world is helpful, but ultimately the Holy Ghost is smarter than all of that. So if we have him with us at all times, we'll be able to cut through and discern a lot of that information.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's powerful. And then you had opportunity to interview. I was green with envy as you got to interview Elder Bednar, and you had some other interviewers there with you. And anything about that or that comes to mind or stories?
Yeah, that was a stressful one for me because I was interviewing, but I was also the production team.
Oh yeah,
and so I had 4 cameras running and five lav mics, and I guess I had 10 lav mics because I was double miking everybody and all the lights. And so I'm like checking cameras while also trying to interview other bed. So it was a lot. It was a little bit overwhelming for me. But no, it was the funny thing with interviewing Elder Bednar was I have watched him religiously. Like he's one of my favorite apostles, just to watch his Q&As. And so I've seen him interact in these settings dozens of times. And I shouldn't have been surprised, but nothing surprised me. Like he was just, even the answers he was giving, I'm like, I knew he'd say that. Like he always says that, line upon line, precept upon precept. I come with a question, I should have known that would have been the answer, and obviously he's expounding upon it, but it was just, I guess, interesting to see that similar to Elder Anderson, it's like, I'm not here to give you some mystical, answer that you've never heard before. Like the gospel answers are simple. I'll help apply it to what your specific question is, but there's not a lot of earth-shattering information that's going to just crazy build our testimony. The gospel's pretty simple, and I think we try and make it more complicated than it needs to be. And so every time I'm with the brethren, I just feel, I guess, the simplicity of it all.
Yeah.
There's just this reassurance that when you're in their presence, it's like, oh, they know, and they're conveying it in the most simple and loving way. And that should be a testimony and an example to us of, I guess, of how overcomplicated we make it sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And that can be found on your channel, The True Millennial, right?
Yeah, the full one's on my channel. We did a shortened version that's on the church's flagship channel as well.
Cool.
But
Nice. Any other story or point or angle from social media or church work or anything like that?
Nothing comes to mind specifically. Okay. I think it's just that idea that I'm trying my best to provide the little time and talents I have, but we need everybody, you know?
Yeah.
And I even other content creators or filmmakers, like we could use help at the church as well. If you have free time to be able to go shoot for, like, cause when we go out to these, different places around the world, we're hiring local shooters all the time. So even if you're like in the Philippines, for example, a member listening in the Philippines and you have a camera and are a filmmaker, like you can help the work. Like we'd love to be able to have people all over the place to be able to contribute. So that's just the message I'm always sending, is like, I don't think I'm anyone special. I'm just willing to volunteer my time.
Yeah.
And so I'm being presented some fun opportunities and some ways in which to serve, but you know, there's nothing greatly special about my talents that I should be doing this over anybody else. Like it's just that I'm willing to do it. And so if we had more people willing to do it, there would be more awesome opportunities for other people to get involved and serve. And I mean, ultimately I feel more fulfilled and happy in life when I'm serving, you know? And so I don't know, I guess just reach out and look for opportunities to help, whether locally or downtown, you know?
Yeah. So take me to the local church or the ward level, because the popular episode that I've done on Leading Saints is called "Why Your Ward Needs a Podcast." You know, being a podcaster, I attempted this in a few wards, and I was surprised how effective it was just having a ward podcast where it's not for the general public, but
just for the
as a ward.
Interesting.
Let's learn about each other's stories, their faith development. So
I love that.
I'm curious, anything comes to mind, and it doesn't have to be just for the ward, but even maybe a local communications council that's trying to be aware. Any content creation ideas or things that local wards could do?
The funny thing is that half of my True Millennial interviews, my podcast, is just people in my neighborhood or in my stake or in the area, you know? So it's like, I'd say at least 7 or 8 of them is pretty much a ward podcast, you know? So that just kind of shows you that, and a lot of those stories are very shareable and relatable and have been passed around. And so that just kind of shows you, like, even in your own ward, there's plenty of opportunities to go tell stories and to have conversations that can be shared with. And even if it's just your ward that watches it, great. Like those are the people that know you and will be influenced by that testimony the most. And if it gets shared outside of that, awesome. But even if it doesn't, it's still worth it, you know? But no, I think that's an awesome idea. My wife and I got called to be stake communication specialists last year. And we were kind of tasked with this idea of help us communicate the stake's messages to our stake presidency.
Oh, cool.
And so we started an Instagram account, and this is tough because, I mean, they're already so busy. And so you hate to be like, hey, we need you to do this and that for content. You know, they're like, well, I'm already donating all my time for free. Like now I'm having another side gig to be a content creator. And so like, you don't want to push too hard. But there's definitely been some good opportunities. Like we'll do stake conference invite videos, where we'll just give them some scripts and have them, we're next to the temple, so we have that as a nice backdrop. So we'll have them walking around temple grounds and just inviting members to stake conference, just to kind of help get people excited and coming out, to boost numbers, to get people to come out and actually listen to stake conference. So we've been doing that, and we did one. In fact, he sat in this chair, one of the stake presidency members. He had given a really awesome testimony in a combined meeting. And I just said, hey, I was in nursery and I popped in and barely got to hear that. And it was so impactful to me. I said, but there's a lot of parents and people in the ward who are, you know, in different classrooms doing their callings that didn't get to hear that. What do you think about coming into the studio, filming and just telling that testimony, that story again, and we can put it on our stake Instagram account? And he was reluctant, but he's like, all right, like they're humble guys. They don't want to be these spotlight on camera. And I'm always telling these awesome leaders around us, like, members, we crave leadership. We crave our leaders communicating with us regularly, sharing their tests, bolstering our faith on a regular basis. I don't think there's any member who would lament or be, you know, upset about a stake president coming on social media once a week on a stake account bearing his testimony. I just don't think anyone's going to be offended by that. I think they'll be very glad to hear regularly from their leaders. So anyway, I convinced him to come in. He sat down and shared the testimony, and he was very emotional, and there was a ton of power behind it. And, you know, I did a little bit of my, put a little bit of my sauce into it and put some B-roll on there, music. Anyway, it was by far the most shared thing that we'd put on the stake conference Instagram page, is just a testimony.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much we can do, announcements and all that, invitations, but at the end of the day, people are really affected most, in my opinion, just by pure testimony.
Yeah.
And so that's what I found, at least with that stake account.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I'm just thinking from a practical level, you know, in leadership, like when it comes to announcements, it's like, okay, I did at the beginning of sacrament meeting, nobody's there.
Right.
So maybe we'll try at the end of sacrament meeting. But then, you know, you get to an activity and then they're like, why didn't anybody tell me that? We've been announcing it, right? Or the bulletin or the program, or even now, you know, you can send email blasts. And even that's like, people have sort of sworn off email, like there's so many messages in there.
Yeah.
And so to have a simple stake word account, even just putting, hey, guess what? Stake conferences this week.
Right.
And here's the time. Like, here's the visiting authority or whatever. It's powerful.
Well, I always say, like, where are people spending their time?
Yeah.
Go to where they're at. They're on social media. Mm-hmm. For better or worse, probably for worse, they're mostly spending their time on social media, right? That's where they hang out all day. So if you want them to see those announcements and see those testimonies, go to where they are. You know, they're not hanging out in emails. Yeah. They're hanging out on Instagram.
Yeah. Yeah. Another approach I learned from, I interviewed, I can't think of the name of the stake off the top of my head, but I believe they're in California, and they created this Instagram account that was more like community focused, even though it was like the church communication people were behind it. And there wasn't this hidden method of like, they're trying to baptize people in the community, but they would just go and highlight different businesses in the community, interview people, or, hey, this fair's going on this week, right? And every once in a while they'd mention, you know, service projects the church is doing or their ward is doing. And just having that presence out there, I mean, it grew quite a bit just in that, you know, it was kind of a small community. And again, there's a lot you can do there. It doesn't have to be like, okay, we've put the word announcements on there, and now what do we do? You know, there's so many ways to slice it.
Yeah, so after our stake calling, we then got called shortly after to be area communication specialists, or I don't know what the exact phrase was. Yeah. But it was not just our stake, it was the whole southern Utah area. And they said, similar to what you're saying, like, we just want to unite the community and give people opportunities to come together, interfaith, not just our church. Like, let's show people, you know, one, bring the church out of obscurity and show some of the good things we're doing and the service opportunities, and allow people to get involved with some of the local things they can do, but also just opportunities to get to know people of other faiths and you know, to be a community. Yeah. So it's been really cool being a part of some of these callings and just seeing the power of social media. Mm-hmm. And I harp on this all the time, but I think we are sorely underutilizing these tools that Elder Bednar tells us have been saved for these days. Yeah. Like, they were given to us in these days, not for cat videos, but to preach the gospel and further the work and prepare for the kingdom of God, you know? And so I think we sit here and doom scroll, you know, consuming all day. And I think we need to think a little bit more. How can I be more of a creator and less of a consumer with this tool? How can I use it to actually produce something of value rather than just consuming things, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if there's anything here, but that's kind of something I've wrestled with, because these tools, this social media, you know, they're designed in such a way that can be very addicting. Yeah. You know, the doom scroll thing. I mean, we've all been there. Right. We'll probably be there later tonight. You know, it's just, you know, I remember my parents, you know, they would wind down with the evening news, right, and maybe an episode of MASH, you know, and that was sort of their wind down. But now it's like, you know, it's 2 a.m. and I'm still scrolling, you know, there's no hard cutoff. And so sometimes I often compare it to like a drug house of like, everybody needs to be on social media. I feel like, we know the drug house. There's a lot of addicted people, a lot of craziness going in there, but you got to go in the drug house in order to talk about the gospel. You know, like, I don't want to go in the drug house though, you know? Is there any thought or wisdom that comes to like, how do we balance all that, where it's like, because some people will swear off social media and bless their hearts, right? And there's several apps that maybe I've uninstalled for long periods of times just to take a breather. But anything comes to mind around that?
I definitely do the same. I go through periods where I have to delete apps and social media fast because I feel myself getting into bad habits. So there's definitely a space for that and a time for swearing off and getting off. I don't think it's ever wise to get off completely because I think I think there's something to being in the world but not of the world.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where the world is.
Yep.
They're on social media.
Yep.
And so if we're not somewhat in the world, we can't relate. We can't understand what people are going through. Like some of the value I get out of social media consuming wise is just consuming some of my other friends' posts to see what's going on in their minds. Like what are they struggling with? Where, you know, and I can't know how to speak to them and relate to them if I don't know where they're at. And weirdly, I don't understand it, but a lot of people are more open to share their most innermost feelings on social media more than they are with any human being one-on-one. And so you actually get a lot of deep thoughts from people if you're willing to follow them on Instagram and Facebook and whatnot. But I think there's something to that of being where people are, but being in control and not becoming of it and just turning it into a doom scroll. Like there has to be a lot of discipline that is learned in that space, and it may mean that you have to delete it at times to keep yourself in check. But I don't think it's smart to swear it off because then we can't influence on the space where we can most effectively influence.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And sometimes there's this heaviness to it of like, it feels like, you know, we feel this calling like you articulated with yours where I've got to reach a broad audience. I got to get out there, preach the gospel, share good news. And so I see a lot of people jump on social media and create some account, you know, and it just sort of flounders for years and years. Again, like we talked about, 50 people, 100 people, it's somebody. But we sort of like over invested in these social media ways of like sharing goodness where sometimes it's like, why don't you every once a month or every other week invite neighbors over to your house and have a connection point, right? 100%. Like that can be really powerful, or just the old school of sharing your testimony or like taking the Book of Mormon to your neighbor or whatever, right? I know it's a
we
lot
almost
more
give
difficult.
them too much power.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right.
100%.
And so just to step back and really be thoughtful about it. You don't have to create that Instagram channel and expect it to blow up in order to share the gospel. There's all these little nuances.
On that note, that was probably I talked about it being shocking when I made the account and saw how much people really were hungry for it and were sharing the stuff and it was growing fast. But the second shock factor was when it was doing really well and was exploding and we were having some posts getting over 1 million views and tens of thousands of shares, and yet it felt all kind of empty to me. It kind of felt like, I'm sure there's some good being done here, but I really don't have a clue because there's no one-on-one personal interaction with any of these humans. And I get messages here and there, people saying this is really helpful. And so in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, I should keep doing it. It's helpful. But if we're, like you're saying, if we're not simultaneously fostering the relationships in real life with the people closest to us, I agree. I think we're missing the mark. And we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and it's been interesting as we have put ourselves online very publicly about our faith and coming across, I'm sure, to some as judgmental or self-righteous, as much as we try not to be. Some people are just going to get that feeling because you're never going to share the gospel perfectly. So some people aren't going to like the way you approach it. But as we've been putting ourselves out publicly, we live down in St. George. All of our family lives up north, family and friends. That's where we grew up. My wife and I both felt very strongly, these promptings start to come in that it's great what you're doing on social media, good work, use the tools, but you're neglecting your real relationships. And we both felt very strongly that I think we need to move back up north. Not that we don't have relationships down here, but our closest ones are up north. And we almost felt like, man, we're very public about our faith, but then we're not backing up those things that we're talking about, principles, with living those interpersonally with the people that we're closest to and love the most. And I don't know, I just felt very personally that the Spirit was chastising me, saying, your Instagram, it's not doing any good if the people closest to you don't know that you love them.
Yeah.
And you're not showing that on a regular basis. And so I'm like, oh shoot, so it's been an interesting shift for both of us, realizing if you're going to be putting yourself out publicly online, it has to be accompanied with this extra effort to really connect and love and serve the people that know you.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it comes across as hypocritical.
Yeah. It takes my mind to I think there's some psychology term for it, but like the human machine was only built for like villages of 150, 200 people.
I've heard like
right?
250 is what I've heard. Yeah.
And like if there's a tragedy within our tribe, our community there, like we can process it, we can handle it, we can show up but now we're in billions of 7 billion tribe where something happens in Ukraine or in a different state or whatever, like, and we're just bombarded with that. Like we can't process it. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to live bigger than we are, which I think you're articulating well. And so to me, it's like, that's where if you feel that drive, like focus on what can I do for my ward? Like how can I show up differently at church? Because that tribe you can process, you can live in, rather than trying to say, oh, I got to share the gospel with somebody across the world and maybe they'll get baptized or, whatever it is. But there's so much good you can do locally with these, whether it's familiar relationships or, community relationships. So,
and one thing I'll point out is when I invite people to use social media to share the gospel, it's kind of like serving a mission. Yeah, you'll probably bless someone's life here and there and impact someone here and there. In my opinion, it's as much for you as it is for anybody else. It's getting you in the habit of regularly sharing your testimony. Mm-hmm. And it's like we have fast and testimony meeting once a month. So there's one opportunity a month to share your testimony. You have an opportunity every day to share your testimony. When the Spirit prompts you and says, ooh, you should share that, go share it.
Yeah.
And even if it's Instagram gives you the ability to only do stories to select people. So if you want to do just these 20 people that know me best and even address them personally, hey, family, just wanted to let you know, because, I don't know how everyone feels about family threads, but I have a huge family thread, and sometimes
we all do.
Sometimes it's like way too much going on in there. So maybe don't ping them individually, but if you just do an Instagram story that's send out just to your family members and say, hey, I just wanted to share a quick thought I had. I was reading the scriptures, and like it can be that intimate even with this tool of social media, just the family members themselves, But it's what I'm saying is it's great if you help somebody along the way in sharing your testimony, but the process over the past 2 years of sharing my testimony through this True Millennial account, by far, I'm confident has blessed my life more than anybody else's that's watched any of my videos.
Yeah.
It has refined me in a way that, I'm getting tons of criticism, and some of it's just rude, but some of it is like, I could probably do that better. Or I could probably, well, that's a good point about how I said that. And I could probably say that a little bit more inclusively or whatever it is, so with every post I do, I'm refining, and the Spirit chastises me and helps me become a better, more refined version of myself. And it's honestly humbling.
Yeah.
It's humbling to have to put yourself out there. But I think that's why it's a commandment. God wants us to share our testimony and share the gospel as much for ourselves as anybody else.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I appreciate you mentioned like the family thread, because sometimes we feel like, oh, I'm supposed to do these things. Like I'm supposed to share every good moment out there. So, keep feeding the machine. But oftentimes I feel like I'm having this special moment with my son. Maybe he said something, we're reading the scriptures or whatever. Yeah. I'll take a picture, or I'll find this quote in general conference that just hit my heart, and I'll just share it with my family. Yeah. And that's it. And that, to me, that's like
great.
Good enough.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, I don't have to share everything with the world, right? Or anything.
Right.
But having a community that you can share is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if it is your text thread, that's great. If that's an appropriate place for it, great. I'm always encouraging my father and my father-in-law. I'm like, look, I look up to you guys, and I want to hear from you more regularly. I know that both of you are studying and preparing talks, and
great.
I'm not in your ward. I want to hear about it. And so we've kind of forced my father-in-law to, whenever he prepares a lesson for his local ward, we're like, well, tell us when those days are, and we'll jump on a Zoom call, and anyone who wants to join, no one has to, But anyone who
Yeah.
wants to join in a Zoom call, just send us a link and say, hey, 7:00 tonight, I'm just going to talk about some of the things I prepared this week in my lesson. And they're amazing. Like, it's just so awesome. It's almost like a third hour Sunday activity, is just to be able to hear from one family member who prepared something for their ward that we all get to have an intimate conversation about.
Yeah.
So there's so many forms. It doesn't have to be Instagram and YouTube. Those are just tools to be able to get this out. You know?
No, that's so true. It's sort of a family history angle to that, where can you imagine if in some parallel universe we got the Instagram feed or the family text thread from our grandfather in 1940s, what did he say? Like, how did he articulate? What did that church, that church talk sound like when he gave it or whatever? Like, I would give anything for that. And here we are. And I actually sat down during COVID with my dad and recorded 11 episodes of his living history,
awesome.
right? Just like this
I love
talking.
that.
And someday in 20, 30 years when he's gone, like, that'll be priceless. I mean, and I got to get with my mom. I got to keep doing that, right? So it's just powerful.
And that's why I told my father-in-law, I said, you don't even have to make it public, but upload, like, if we don't have time to get together in a Zoom call, just record yourself talking about what you talked about that day in your class, some of the things you learned in your studies that week. Upload it to YouTube as an unlisted link that no one can see publicly if you don't want it to be public, and then just share us that YouTube link unlisted. And if we have free time, we get to listen to our father-in-law for a half hour, talk about the gospel and share his testimony.
That's powerful.
That's a much better thing to consume than whatever else I was going to listen to today. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It's like, just give people the opportunity to consume testimony.
Yeah.
You know?
That's great. Well, what final encouragement would you give to, let me make sure we plug, obviously, True Millennial, primarily on YouTube is probably the best place to find it, right? Do you have a podcast feed or anything?
Yeah, I'm bad at uploading to other platforms.
But YouTube's
YouTube
for sure.
is the main place. The shorter form stuff's on Instagram.
Okay.
I wish people would come to YouTube more, because that's where I like the longer form stuff.
Yeah.
But I know some people's attention spans are a little shorter. So we have shorter stuff on Instagram, and those always get 10 times more views. But if you want to get more in depth, to YouTube, yep.
Cool. Awesome. What final encouragement would you give to church leaders around some of these topics we've talked about? Or
just don't fear social media. I know it's really hard, especially for the older generations. We grew up with it. I don't know. How old are you?
I'm 42.
Yeah, you're young.
Yeah.
We were in the very beginnings of using social media, like I was in high school and Facebook just started, but just don't fear it. I think a lot of the leaders I'm working with, there's just a lot of hesitancy there. It's just uncomfortable new ground, and just recognize the power that it is and be willing to take baby steps, even if it's like unlisted videos or just the small steps just to start getting comfortable with the tools. But don't avoid them. They're here for a reason, and we got to learn how to embrace them.